Today's throwback will be on The Doors. The Doors consisted of Jim Morrison, Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore. Together, they were the band that sparked the imaginations of many of their listeners. The songwriting skills of Jim Morrison, the electric poet himself, can be seen in his repertoire of songs between 1967 and 1971. Although, to be fair, most of the songs can be credited to The Doors and not just to one person. Anyway, we're going to go from album to album and look at their careers before Jim Morrison's death. Bear in mind the Doors still produced albums after 1971, but for our purposes, we will focus on the albums that only consisted of Jim Morrison's inclusion with the band. Now, let's continue. 1967 was the breakout year for the Doors, with the release of the eponymous self-titled album, The Doors.
Night divides the day. Try to run, try to hide. Break on through to the other side. Break on through to the other side. Break on through to the other side, yeah.
The entire first side of the album is great. You have Break On Through, the Crystal Ship, Alabama song, which wasn't composed by the Doors, but by Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill, and the 7-minute masterpiece Light My Fire. What's more amazing about the album is, although the album was released in 1967, all the recordings were completed by the end of 1966, around the same time John Lennon composed Strawberry Fields Forever.
Strawberry Fields Forever.
So the Doors was very ahead of the rock and roll curve by that point. The second side of the album I disregard, namely because most of the songs on that side I just don't care to listen to. That's just me though. I mean, I tried sitting through the 11-minute song The End, but like Revolution 9, I couldn't sit through the entire song. I only made it to the 6th minute and bailed out. The Doors released another 1967 album called Strange Days.
People are strange when you're a stranger. Places look ugly when you're alone.
Strange Days was predicted to be bigger than what the Beatles did with Sgt. Pepper, released only a few months before this album, but it wasn't as commercially successful as previously thought. Still, it is not an album to completely ignore. On one side of the album you have Love Me Two Times, which is very catchy and original, and on side 2 we have People Are Strange and When the Music's Over. But again, the latter song I couldn't completely finish listening to. I tried listening to it, but by the 9th minute I just dropped out of the song. Overall, some of the songs on there are as catchy and as memorable as the album that preceded it, but I believe it is not exactly as good as The Doors. I will not disregard that album, however, because it paved the way for more experimentation with the Doors songwriting. This was the last Doors album from 1967, and from there the band began to evolve a bit. Here's what I like about the Doors. They stay the same in each album. That's not entirely a good thing, because with Black Sabbath and the Beatles, they sounded slightly different. But in this case, here's the exception. Between 1967 and 1968, the Doors made 3 albums, and the Doors managed to sound nearly the same in each one. But each one just sounds so different in terms of songwriting and arrangement. I mean, with the first album it was psychedelic, but with the second album it seemed more down-to-earth and less acid-toned. And here's another thing. To be able to sound nearly the same in every album and yet sound different from everyone else is a great achievement. It allowed for the Doors to create their own style of music rather than sound the same in comparison with another band. You know who else did that? Cream, and you can guess their popularity as a result. The next Doors album was released in 1968 and was titled Waiting for the Sun.
Hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name? Hello, I love you, let me jump in your game. Hello.
This one sounds a bit different than the previous albums, but nearly the same as well. Ray Manzarek basically switched keyboards at the time, which made the band sound a little different, yet their style remained the same. But overall, between 1967 and 1968, the Doors did sound alike in their albums. Anyway, the first side consists of the classic Hello, I Love You, as well as songs such as The Unknown Soldier, which is okay, but not as memorable as the other Doors songs out there. On the second side, you have Spanish Caravan and 521, which again are decent songs, but not as impactful as Hello, I Love You or other Doors songs. The album is the shortest album recorded by the band. Short, but sweet. The album is a good listen. It's as good as Strange Days, but still does not compare to the eponymous status of the Doors, released nearly a year before. To be honest, Strange Days and other albums after it simply follow the same lyrical formulas. Only the instruments seem to change. The Doors retain their own style that way, which is not too innovative, but yet very true to their songwriting, which leaves it strong and solid. In 1969, the Doors released their most complicated album, The Soft Parade.
I'm gonna love you till the stars fall from the sky for you and I.
This album had more instruments. This reminds me of the Beatles because we have string instruments accompanying the Doors and their instruments. This annoyed the fans because they wanted the Doors and not a bunch of instruments behind them. This was why Sgt. Pepper was criticized, because the critics believed it sounded too ostentatious with the string sections and the brass sections included with the Beatles. Anyway, Robbie Krieger contributed a lot to this album. He was responsible for the great song Touch Me, and not Jim Morrison. Gasp! But either way, the album does not have as many memorable songs as the ones before it. It does have Touch Me, but what else does it have? Well, it has the Soft Parade, but it's 7 minutes, and I never heard it. Really, the only song anyone remembers from this album is Touch Me. So I'll just say that this album, it was okay, but still, not as good as in comparison to the first album. The next album released by the Doors in 1970 was Morrison Hotel.
Blood in the streets in the town of New Haven. Blood stains the roofs and the palm trees of Venice. Blood in my love in the...
Morrison Hotel displays the Doors' reversion to more basic instrumentation and to their roots. While it does go back to a simpler format, the music just sounds different than from Strange Days or any album before that. It just does. Anyway, on side 1, which is labeled Hard Rock Cafe, you have Roadhouse Blues and Peace Frog, which is great because these are the memorable tracks that the Doors had the capacity to create. Side 2, called Morrison Hotel, is something that I can disregard, namely because none of these tracks on there I've never listened. And besides, none of these tracks are on the Doors' Best Of album anyway, so I can simply ignore those. This reversion back to basics really gave this album a better reception than the Soft Parade, although the producers left on the Doors because it was considered cocktail rock. The last studio album recorded with Jim Morrison was released in 1971 and was called L.A. Woman.
All your love is gone to sing a lonely song of a deep blue dream. 7 horses seem to be...
This album was the last hurrah for the Doors prior to Jim Morrison's death, but this album reminds me so much of their first album. The Doors going back to basics and to their roots really made this album more successful in its own right. On side 1 you have Love Her Madly and L.A. Woman, of course. Both, of course, are great songs that are as memorable as anything. The second side is composed of the 7-minute classic Riders on the Storm, which is a very classic tune. Anyone can remember that thing. The great thing is that it reminds me of the first and second albums. Their style didn't change, which threatened to happen under the Soft Parade with all the string additions and what have you. However, L.A. Woman was the Doors' last impression upon the classic rock world with their own style and their songwriting under Jim Morrison. Morrison died during the album's release, so he was lucky enough to be alive while the album was in production. The album is a winner, and it's almost as memorable as the first album release. In conclusion, the Doors left an impression upon the classic rock genre that remains to this day. It is interesting to hear the music from the Doors because it seems quirky and different enough to sound wonderful. It separated from the guitar-laden styles of Cream and Led Zeppelin around that time. It experimented, but the only thing was that this experimentation was received negatively by the demographics at the time. The Soft Parade was a classic example. But other than that, the Doors maintained a musical style and a lyrical formula that made it easy for them to develop memorable and catchy songs, some of which are played on the radio today. It is easy to disregard the Doors, but just as easy to fall in love with them. The Doors are classic, and that is why they are classic rock gold. Ladies and gentlemen, that was tonight's Throwback. This is Youngblood Fantasy 92, and I'll see you next time.